This is the sermon for May 22nd, 2022, The Power of Life in the Face of Death. And I'm going to read first from John 20, 1 through 18, and I have shortened it some. Early in the morning of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been taken away. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple and said, "They have taken Jesus' body from the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Mary stood outside near the tomb, crying. As she cried, she bent down to look into the tomb. She saw two angels. The angels asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She replied, "They have taken away my master, and I don't know where they've put him." As soon as she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabbi," which means my teacher. Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." And from Revelation 21, 3 through 6. I heard a voice thunder from the throne, "Look, look, God has moved into the neighborhood, making a home with women and men. They're God's people. The divine is their God. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death is gone for good. Tears gone. Crying gone. Pain gone. All the first order of things gone." The enthroned continued, "Look, I'm making everything new." Then God said, "From water of life well, I give freely to the thirsty." May God bless our hearing of these scriptures. Well, I'm returning to the foundational Easter story again because this is key to the church. And we shouldn't celebrate it once a year. We should celebrate it often in the season of Easter and also throughout the year. And I wanted to lay it right alongside the Revelation passage in order to compare them and to see what you think and to ask some questions about the two scriptures together. And I've never done this before. So first I want to say that in the Easter story, grief is a human response to the death of a loved one. Your love is real when you are grieving. Your love is real. Your memories are significant. Your sense of having been beloved is still real. And at the tomb, Mary's in grief at the death of her beloved teacher. She's weeping. This is a natural human response to grief. On top of that, she thinks that somebody's moved the body, and she speaks to the gardener about this because she wanted to care for the body. And I know this is something we don't do in our culture. We give it to professionals, but in Mary's day, they wanted to do it themselves, especially the women. So the disciples were also grieving. It was the end of a dream. And then they found themselves denying they even knew Jesus. And after death, they recalled the tragic ending of what had happened, and they were in grief. And when Mary saw the tomb, she didn't think, Jesus is immortal. She didn't think, there's a resurrection. No, she thought someone's stolen the body, which is a logical thing to think. So what do we understand about the great mystery of the resurrection? Mary didn't know about it. What do we know? What do we understand about what is true about the resurrection? Was it once for all? Is everything final after that? I don't think so, or we wouldn't have this Revelation passage. Resurrection was real, but everything else was a mystery. Everything about it is a mystery, especially in that day. I think it's still a mystery. Today's reading from Revelation is at the end of what we know about the written history of the church. And in it, we're talking about the people being reassured that death will be no more. So we have this Easter story at the beginning of the written history of the church. And we have Revelation, a promise that death will be no more, and weeping and crying and pain will be no more at the end of the written history. So what's true? What's true about resurrection? Easter didn't take care of it, or we wouldn't have this promise in Revelation. That's what I wanted to ask today. So the people are being reassured in Revelation that death will be no more. So it wasn't all solved on Easter. So the Jewish people also firmly believed, passionately believed, that God would take care of death and destruction. God would heal the earth. And while God was at it, oppression would end, suffering would end, and that God would solve the problem of evil in the world. Now, the Jewish people believed this, and yet we had Jesus, and yet we have this passage in Revelation. So when is resurrection fully having taken care of death? When is the end of death? That's the question that I want to ask today. As the days passed, the disciples discovered that a new and bright day had come in Jesus. And this is the key. The reason that resurrection was powerful for the disciples is because they received courage to speak truth to power and to be transformed from regular, common individuals exactly like us, falling down on the job, failing at things, and yet they wouldn't be lost in grief anymore. And instead, they would receive courage in the here and now. For them, it was the here and now. They spoke truth to power like Ukrainians speak truth to power in Russia with Putin, or the way Russians have spoken truth to power with Putin. The outcome is fairly certain, right? You'll be killed, you'll be disappeared, you'll be sent to Siberia in a gulag. The outcome is fairly certain, and yet there have been Russians who spoke truth to power. Wow. So, yeah. So my interest in the resurrection is the here and now, and not pie in the sky by and by. So the resurrection story, it is Jesus who speaks to Mary, and yet Mary doesn't know until he speaks her name. And so I think there's a personal aspect to the power of resurrection that can happen at any time in our lives. What about Lazarus? He was raised from the tomb. If you take the story literally, who knows? If that's also a great mystery to us. And then he died again. He didn't live forever after Jesus raised him. Was that a miracle? Because he died twice? Some people have said he suffered and died twice. How is that a miracle? So we have Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones. We have stories of life overcoming death throughout the entire scriptures, from Hebrew scriptures on up through the disciples living and walking with Jesus on the earth. And then we have it in the Easter story, and then we have it again in Revelation. Where is resurrection true? How is it true? When is it final? It's a good question. So when we speak truth to power, we need courage for it. And we haven't been challenged in America. We're very comfortable as disciples of Jesus, and we tend not to need courage and speak with courage. And so how is it? If we speak against racism, if we were to speak against the KKK, which is active today, if we were to speak against the injustice of white supremacy and racism, would we need courage? I think we would. There are lots of places. Our own government at times, our own government defends racism and hatred of women at times, and yet we don't speak truth to power. partly because we're comfortable, and partly because we are afraid of the consequences, even with our peers. And so, what about speaking truth to power and courage from the resurrection? Well, the resurrection at Easter and today is God's resounding answer to the world's power brokers. The world's power brokers are corrupt. They want only power. They want only their own interests. They want more money and more power, and they aren't interested in the little common people like us. And so how do we speak truth to power with them? Even though the resurrection is real, and even though we receive courage to speak the truth, we still encounter death, injustice, and suffering. And we cry out, when, O Lord, when? When will things be final? When will the resurrection power be evident to everybody? That's the cry of people throughout time. How do we get courage from resurrection? How do we challenge unjust powers? What is guaranteed? And what is the miracle? I think when Jesus spoke Mary's name, there was an intimacy and love, power and miracle in that. And I think that's true today when God speaks to us, and when we speak to one another with courage, with intimacy, with care, with compassion. There's a miracle in that. And that takes courage. That really takes courage to love one another as Christ loved us. There's the miracle right there. And so we can't prove that the final word about our lives is Jesus' resurrection. There's no proof for it. But love makes our lives meaningful. We're living in the here and now, and we need power and courage for the here and now. No church can do it by themselves. No Christian can do it by him or herself. We need courage with one another. We need even the connectional system in the United Methodist Church to speak truth to power and to make a difference in the world. We need one another. The disciples were ordinary people. We're ordinary people. Remember, the disciples stumbled along after Jesus, confused a lot of the time. And when they needed to step up, they denied Jesus, and they even fell asleep when Jesus asked them to stay awake. And then after the resurrection, they were transformed into courageous people. What was that about? How did they receive resurrection power? How do we receive resurrection power? How does it make a difference in our lives? That's my question for this church. How do we receive resurrection power to love others, to make a difference in the world? We are. And there is a difference in the world because we're here. And yet we value being comfortable, sometimes far more than the courage to speak out. Karl Marx called religion an opiate for the masses. It was like powerful sleeping drugs, because Christians throughout history have sometimes been so heavenly minded they were no earthly good. And I've met lots of Christians who are so heavenly minded. They think about pie in the sky by and by, and they don't think about all that's required here and now. And so this is the challenge for us. We don't need some future response. We need power and courage now from the resurrection. The first witnesses to Easter knew full well that there was transforming power in their lives. Now I want to close with two things. Walter Wink wrote Engaging the Powers. He understood that there were powers of evil at work in the world now. And he says, because they could not kill what was alive in Jesus, the cross also revealed the powerlessness of death. So that's a complicated concept, but Jesus' life was more powerful than death. And So Jesus at his crucifixion neither fights the darkness nor flees from it. Instead, Jesus enters into the darkness, encompasses the darkness, and brings life out of it somehow. Jesus entered the darkness freely and voluntarily. The darkness is not dispelled or illuminated. Jesus didn't make things magically better. Instead, Jesus had tremendous courage to enter into the darkness. How do we do that? And then I have a last story. It happened on a bridge outside of Kansas City. A man had lost all hope and had gotten out of his car, climbing onto the outer framework of the bridge. He was determined to jump. Traffic had come to a stop as people got out of their cars to watch the drama unfold. One police officer talked to him from above while another was putting on a harness with a long rope attached. The rope was attached to one of the squad cars. The talking continued as the second officer lowered himself closer to the desperate man. Suddenly the man jumped. The officer jumped as well, catching the man in mid-air, wrapping his arms and legs around him in a tight embrace. They fell together until the rope ran out, snapping them to a halt, and they swung back and forth over the river. Up on the bridge, people heard the dangling officer yelling at the top of his lungs, "If you go, I go. I'm going to hold on to you as long as it takes." That's the kind of courage that Christ's resurrection gives us. The bottom line is resurrection. It didn't protect Jesus from suffering and death. It doesn't protect us. We at times move through death and somehow out the other side. Life cannot be undone by evil and tragedy. Instead, the Easter message is for us in the here and now. Amen.